She had called him Dad since she first learned to speak. He wiped her tears when she fell off her bike. And 17 years later, he locked her in the basement. What happened next will shock even those who think they've seen everything. This isn't fiction. This is a true crime story. In the quiet residential outskirts of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, winter arrived early in 2016. Snow clung to the sidewalks and coated the brittle branches of leafless trees. On the morning of February 9th, the house at the corner of Belmont and Reeves stood unnaturally still. Inside, Jeremy Watson sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a half-empty mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Just days earlier, his wife Chantel had died unexpectedly from a pulmonary embolism. She had collapsed in the bathroom without warning, her final breath stolen before the paramedics could even arrive. One moment she was brushing her hair, the next, she was gone. Jeremy was 39 years old and had lived in that house with Chantel and her daughter, Amy, for nearly 17 years. He had raised Amy from infancy, changing her diapers, teaching her to walk, holding her hand on her first day of preschool. Though not her biological father, Jeremy had been there for every milestone, every scraped knee, and every school recital. He and Chantel had met when Amy was still in diapers, and from that point forward, the three of them had been inseparable. Now, without Chantel, the house seemed foreign, as though it had been stripped of its center of gravity. The once familiar walls echoed with silence. Photographs on the mantel, family trips to the lake, birthday parties, a trip to Philadelphia Zoo, became painful relics. Amy, 18 now, had withdrawn to her room and barely spoke a word. Jeremy didn't blame her. He himself couldn't speak. The funeral had passed in a blur. There were no large gatherings, no processions of relatives or endless casseroles from neighbors. Chantel's side of the family had mostly drifted away over the years, and Jeremy's own circle had always been small. They buried her in a modest cemetery near the city limits under a slate sky, the wind cutting through the gathering like a warning. Amy had stood beside him, holding a single white rose, her face unreadable. In the days that followed, Jeremy moved through the house like a ghost. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Chantel's perfume. Her coat still hung by the door. In the bathroom, her hairbrush rested on the sink, with strands of her hair caught in the bristles. Jeremy couldn't bring himself to touch any of it. He spent hours at night lying in their bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying their last conversation, the last morning, the last smile. Grief settled into his chest like concrete. He tried to keep up with Amy's routine. He woke her up for school, packed her lunch, and left the porch light on for her in the evenings. But she didn't talk. She would take her food without looking at him, walk to the school bus without a word, and retreat to her room the moment she returned. Jeremy, in turn, became more withdrawn. He stopped going to work. His employer, a local plumbing and electrical firm, called twice and then stopped. He let the bills pile up unopened. Groceries became scarce. He lost track of days. The world outside blurred into irrelevance. The neighborhood noticed, but didn't intervene. A few neighbors nodded sympathetically when they saw Jeremy at the mailbox, but no one stepped inside. The Watsons had always kept to themselves. The only real disruption came from the mailman, who continued to deliver condolence cards and community notices that Jeremy refused to open. At night, the house creaked and shifted in the cold. Jeremy found himself talking out loud, sometimes to Chantel, sometimes to no one at all. He started sleeping on the couch, unable to bear the emptiness of their shared bedroom. The TV flickered in the background, always muted. Amy's footsteps upstairs were soft and frequent. Once, he stood outside her door, his hand raised to knock, but he didn't. There was nothing to say. He knew he should reach out to someone, maybe Chantel's cousin in Philadelphia, maybe a grief counselor. But he didn't. Instead, he drifted from room to room like a man searching for something he couldn't name. The framed wedding photo on the hallway wall seemed to mock him. Chantel had been smiling, full of life. Jeremy looked older now, though only a week had passed. His beard had grown out in patches of gray, his skin drawn and pale. Amy, for all her silence, was the only constant in the house. Her presence, though muted, anchored Jeremy in reality. She was the last thread connecting him to the life they once had. And though he didn't realize it yet, that thread would soon begin to fray. Time in the Watson home no longer followed clocks or calendars. It followed memories. Jeremy marked his days by which part of Chantel's voice he could still hear in his head. Morning laughter. Afternoon humming. Evening whispers. He held on to those fragments with desperate reverence. Without them, the house was just wood and drywall. And without Chantel, it was only him and Amy, drifting further from each other in a house that no longer felt like home. Amy Watson turned 18 just 2 weeks after her mother's funeral. There was no cake, no candles, no celebration. The day passed like all the others, quiet, cold, and heavy with absence. She spent most of it in her room, curled beneath a blanket on the floor, surrounded by notebooks, old photos, and the faded scent of her mother's perfume clinging to a sweater she refused to wash. It had once been her mother's favorite, oversized and soft. Now it was Amy's shield against a world that no longer made sense. She was a senior at Harrisburg High School, expected to graduate in a few months. Before her mother's death, she had been a promising student, disciplined, polite, often called mature for her age. Teachers described her as focused, if somewhat withdrawn. She never caused trouble, never skipped class. But after February, her demeanor shifted. She stopped answering questions in class. She avoided eye contact. Her homework became sporadic. She stopped participating in extracurricular activities. Her voice, once calm and articulate, became rare. At home, she barely ate. The kitchen table remained set for two, but Amy rarely joined her stepfather, Jeremy. Meals went untouched. Her appetite had vanished, replaced by a constant, hollow feeling in her chest. Nights were worst. The house groaned with old wood and cold air, but the silence between the walls seemed louder than ever. She could hear Jeremy moving around downstairs, opening and closing drawers, walking in and out of rooms as if searching for something. Their paths rarely crossed. When they did, it was brief, a nod, a glance, a passing movement in the hallway. Words seemed dangerous now, as though speaking them might break something fragile. Amy used to talk to her mother every night. They would sit on her bed, sometimes with cups of tea, and talk about college applications, favorite books, what life would be like in 5 years. Now those memories played like distant films behind her closed eyes. Her mother's voice was fading faster than she could bear. In her journals, Amy tried to preserve fragments, phrases her mother used to say, recipes she cooked from memory, little things like how she always hummed when folding laundry. Writing was her way of fighting back the erasure. At school, Amy's best friend, Layla, noticed the change. They had grown up together, sharing secrets, clothes, and dreams about moving to New York City after graduation. Layla was bright, outgoing, and full of energy, a stark contrast to Amy's reserved nature. She tried to pull Amy back into life, suggesting lunch outings, group projects, and parties. One Friday afternoon in March, Layla invited Amy to a birthday party at a classmate's house. She thought it might help, music, people, distraction. But Amy refused. She didn't want to be around laughter or bright lights. She couldn't bear the thought of pretending to be okay. The refusal turned into an argument. Layla accused her of disappearing, of shutting everyone out. Amy, exhausted and brittle, lashed out. She said things she didn't mean, her voice sharp with pain. Layla stormed off. They didn't speak for days. For Amy, it was another door closing. The people around her kept moving forward, but she felt cemented in place, like her life had stopped on the day her mother died and refused to resume. Her room became her world. She pinned old photographs to the wall, pictures of her as a baby in her mother's arms, family vacations, snapshots of birthdays and Christmas mornings. She arranged them in chronological order, trying to hold on to something linear, something stable. At night, she listened to her mother's old CDs, soul, jazz, slow ballads. She wore her mother's jewelry beneath her clothes. At school, her teachers began to show concern. Notes were sent home. Calls were made. But Jeremy said she just needed time, and the system, overloaded with other struggling students, let it go. Jeremy had been her father in every way that mattered. She had never known her biological dad. From her earliest memory, Jeremy had always been there, changing her diapers, teaching her to ride a bike, carrying her to bed when she fell asleep on the couch. She used to call him Daddy without a second thought. He was her protector, her guide, the only constant in her life besides her mother. But now something about him felt different. He looked at her longer than before. His movements seemed slower, more deliberate. She told herself it was grief. Everything was grief now. One evening, she caught him standing in the hallway outside her room. He didn't say anything. Just stood there, looking at the floor. When she opened the door, he turned and walked away. Amy closed it again and locked it, heart-pounding. She began placing her chair under the doorknob at night. She wasn't sure why. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was unease, a growing sense that something had shifted beneath the surface, like hairline cracks in glass just before it shatters. Amy kept her thoughts to herself. She told no one about the chair, about the looks, about the night she heard Jeremy crying in the living room for hours. She internalized everything. She had always been the quiet one, the girl who handled things, the girl who didn't make trouble. But inside her, something had started to fray. Her world was dissolving into shadows. And no one seemed to see. The days in the Watson household had become formless, blending into each other like brushstrokes on a canvas soaked in grief. Jeremy no longer kept track of the calendar. He had stopped checking the mailbox, stopped returning phone calls, stopped shaving. His eyes had darkened, not just from sleeplessness, but from a kind of inward collapse. He wandered the house like someone trapped in a dream that never changed. Most days, he wore the same faded sweatshirt and moved from room to room without purpose. He often stood in the doorway of the master bedroom and stared at the empty bed, sometimes pressing his hand to the pillow Chantel once slept on, as if hoping to feel the warmth that had long since vanished. Amy noticed these changes, even if she didn't speak of them. She saw the dishes piling up in the sink, the laundry forgotten in baskets, the trash can overflowing. She tiptoed around the house like an intruder in her own home, carefully avoiding the spaces where her stepfather lingered in silence. She rarely entered the kitchen anymore. The air there felt heavy, as if saturated with unspoken things. Her meals became inconsistent, sometimes a granola bar, sometimes nothing at all. She drank water from the bathroom sink and slept fully clothed. Her textbooks lay untouched. College application deadlines passed without notice. Jeremy's grief began to take on new forms. He developed strange habits, rearranging the furniture in the middle of the night or sitting for hours in front of the hallway mirror, staring at his own reflection. He would play Chantel's old voicemails repeatedly on speakerphone, as if the sound of her voice might somehow anchor him to reality. Sometimes he would mutter responses to the messages, pretending she had just called. Other times, he would simply sit and listen to the static silence that followed her recorded words. But the deepest shift came in the way he looked at Amy. At first, it was fleeting, a glance held too long, a hand that brushed her shoulder and lingered a moment too much. She told herself it was her imagination, the product of exhaustion and grief. But as days passed, those moments accumulated. He began knocking on her bedroom door at odd hours, asking if she needed anything, even when she clearly didn't. His voice, once familiar and warm, now carried a tone she couldn't identify, something uncertain, something hollow. She tried to dismiss it, but dread began to take root in her stomach. One evening, while Amy was folding clothes in her room, Jeremy appeared in the doorway without warning. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching her. She froze. After a long moment, he turned and walked away. She didn't finish folding the clothes. That night, she placed her desk chair under the doorknob again, hands trembling as she did it. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for footsteps. The next morning, she attempted to leave the house for school, but Jeremy stood in front of the door and told her she wasn't going anywhere. His tone was flat, almost gentle, but there was something beneath it that made her blood run cold. She tried to argue, but he raised his voice, louder than she had ever heard it, and told her to go downstairs. She hesitated, then obeyed, her legs shaking as she descended to the basement. The basement was unfinished, dim, and smelled of dust and damp concrete. Boxes of old decorations, broken furniture, and tools cluttered the corners. He pointed to a small room under the stairs, an old storage space with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. She stepped inside, thinking he would leave her alone to calm down. Instead, he closed the door behind her and locked it. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a cruel misunderstanding born of grief. She knocked, called his name, told him this wasn't funny. No answer. Hours passed. The light bulb buzzed faintly overhead. The concrete floor was cold, the walls uninsulated. She sat against the wall, knees drawn to her chest, her heart pounding. When the door finally opened hours later, he stood there with a plate of food and a bottle of water. He handed them to her without speaking and closed the door again. She cried that night, silently, so he wouldn't hear. He kept her there for 3 days. Each day, he brought food and water, never saying much. He told her she needed to be alone, that she needed to grieve properly. He said she was too distracted, too unfocused. She tried to reason with him, but his mind seemed distant, locked in a world of its own logic. Her pleas went unanswered. The second night, she banged on the door until her hands hurt. No one came. Meanwhile, the outside world began to notice her absence. The school called the house multiple times. Voicemails were left. A guidance counselor sent an email. Jeremy responded once, saying Amy had caught the flu and was too sick to attend. The explanation was accepted without further inquiry. No one showed up at the door. No one came looking. On the third day, he let her out. She emerged from the basement pale, exhausted, disoriented. He told her everything was fine now. That she was safe. That things were going to change. He told her that from now on, she would be sleeping upstairs, in his room. That the house needed a woman again. That she was all he had left. Her silence was immediate and absolute. She walked past him, climbed the stairs, and closed her bedroom door without a sound. Something in the house had broken completely. It was no longer grief that hung in the air. It was something colder, more suffocating. The walls no longer protected. They watched. The rooms no longer sheltered. They confined. The house that had once been a home now pulsed with tension, with a darkness that grew heavier each day. Amy began to understand that no one was coming to save her. She was alone with him, and he was no longer the man who had raised her. After releasing Amy from the basement, Jeremy no longer pretended that things would return to normal. The air in the house had shifted permanently, and the silence that had once connected them in shared mourning had become something else entirely, controlling, possessive, oppressive. Amy moved cautiously through the hallways, unsure of what each new day would bring. Her body ached from the cold concrete she had slept on, her mind dulled by the endless hours of darkness and stillness. But what frightened her more than the confinement was the change she saw in Jeremy's eyes when he looked at her now. He no longer averted his gaze. He watched her constantly, as if trying to memorize her movements. His presence became constant, looming. He followed her around the house under the guise of concern, asking if she needed help in the kitchen, if she wanted company while folding laundry, if she would sit beside him on the couch to watch old home videos of Chantel. The videos played endlessly, looping familiar images of holidays and birthdays. Amy appeared in all of them, smiling, laughing, safe. It was a different life, a different time. Jeremy would watch intently, occasionally glancing at Amy as if comparing the past to the present. She learned to keep her expression blank, unresponsive, afraid that even the smallest reaction would invite more. One morning, as she stepped into the hallway after a restless night, she found her bedroom stripped of her belongings. Her school books, clothes, and photos were gone. Panic rose in her throat. She searched the house until she found everything folded and placed neatly inside the master bedroom closet. Her toothbrush had been moved to the bathroom off Jeremy's room. Her pillows were now arranged beside his on the bed. She didn't have to ask what this meant, he made it clear. He told her she would sleep in his room now. That the master bedroom needed someone else in it. That she would help him carry the weight her mother once bore. He spoke in a tone that mimicked calm authority, but his hands trembled slightly when he said it. Amy felt her stomach twist. She tried to protest, but her voice came out brittle and small. He didn't raise his voice or threaten her. Instead, he acted as if it were a matter already decided, as if he believed they were entering a new phase of family life, one where her role had simply changed. That night, she lay stiffly on the far edge of the bed, fully clothed, facing the wall. Jeremy lay beside her, motionless for hours. The dim light from the hallway spilled across the floor in a narrow line, illuminating the closed door like a boundary she could no longer cross. She didn't sleep. Her breath stayed shallow. Her eyes remained open. Her thoughts circled in silence, unable to grasp the full weight of what was happening. She had nowhere to go. No one to call. She was alone. Days blurred again, only now they followed his rhythm. He decided when she ate, when she slept, when she could go outside. Her phone had long been left uncharged in a drawer. Her school no longer called. The silence from the outside world became its own kind of prison. Jeremy began referring to her by pet names he used to use with her mother. He prepared meals that Chantel used to make. He asked Amy to wear her mother's old jewelry. The transformation was not sudden, but gradual and deliberate, each step pulling Amy further from her own identity and closer to something she could not accept. She tried to keep her mind sharp, to hold on to a sliver of herself. She kept a notebook hidden inside a textbook, where she scribbled notes to herself, reminders of who she was, of the life that had come before. Phrases like "my name is Amy," and "this is not my fault" appeared over and over again in trembling handwriting. It became her lifeline. Jeremy's behavior alternated between eerie kindness and unsettling control. One evening, he brought her a small bouquet of dried flowers and placed them in a vase beside the bed. He said the house felt like a home again. Amy didn't respond. She no longer cried where he could see. She cried only in the shower, or silently at night when she was sure he was asleep. The tears came without sound, without relief. She had never felt so far from herself. She fantasized about running. About opening the front door and sprinting until her legs gave out. But where would she go? She had no relatives nearby. Her friends had moved on. She thought of Layla but hadn't spoken to her in weeks. The shame she carried grew heavier by the day, weighing down every breath. She felt responsible, though she knew she shouldn't. Jeremy had raised her. Loved her. Protected her. Until he didn't. The house, once a sanctuary, had become a twisted imitation of comfort. The living room still held family photos, but now they served as props in a place she didn't understand. The kitchen still smelled like cinnamon and coffee, but the warmth was gone. Every room felt like a set. Every hallway a corridor between two lives, before and after. Amy had become a ghost inside her own skin, performing a version of herself that Jeremy had crafted out of grief, delusion, and need. And yet, beneath it all, a spark remained. Small, faint, but alive. It waited in silence, beneath the layers of fear and obedience. It watched and remembered. It took note of patterns, of keys, of shadows at certain times of day. Because somewhere deep within her, Amy knew that surviving was no longer enough. One day, the moment would come. And when it did, she would be ready. It was just after 6 a.m. when Amy slipped out of the bed without making a sound. Jeremy was still asleep, one arm draped across her side of the mattress, his breathing heavy and uneven. She moved slowly, deliberately, avoiding the creaking floorboards she had memorized over the past weeks. Her shoes were already by the door, her school bag packed the night before and hidden behind the couch. She had rehearsed every step of her escape in her mind, timing, exits, the weight of the front door, the sound of the lock. The plan wasn't perfect, but it was all she had. Her body moved on instinct. Her heart pounded in her ears. Outside, the air was cold and damp with early spring frost. The sky was still dark, and the street was empty. She didn't look back. She walked for several blocks, then began to run. Her legs ached, lungs burning, but she didn't stop. With no family nearby, there was only one place she could go, Layla's house. The girl she hadn't spoken to in weeks, whose friendship she had severed in grief and fear. But now, she needed her. More than anyone. More than ever. It took nearly an hour to reach the neighborhood. Amy approached the familiar house quietly, uncertain if anyone would be awake. She tapped lightly on the bedroom window at the side of the house, hoping Layla still used the same room. Moments later, the blinds moved and a shocked, sleepy face appeared. Layla opened the window with confusion, then widened her eyes when she saw Amy, disheveled, pale, and trembling. Layla didn't ask questions. She unlocked the side door and let her in. Amy stayed mostly silent. She couldn't speak about what had happened, not yet. Her throat felt tight, her body on edge, like a coiled spring. She accepted a blanket, a glass of water, and sat hunched on the floor in the corner of Layla's room. Layla's parents were surprised to find her there when they woke up, but quickly realized something was wrong. They asked if Amy was safe. She nodded, but her eyes said otherwise. They didn't press. They offered breakfast, clean clothes, a shower. She accepted the clothes but declined everything else. By midday, Jeremy arrived. Layla's father answered the door, and Jeremy presented himself as calm and composed. He explained that Amy had been struggling mentally since her mother's death, that she had moments of disorientation, that she had run off before. He thanked them for their concern but insisted everything was under control. His voice was low, controlled, polite. He wore clean clothes, spoke clearly. Layla's parents hesitated. Something about his explanation didn't sit right, but he was persuasive. He insisted Amy needed professional help and a familiar environment. Amy stood behind him, shoulders hunched, lips pressed into a line. She didn't object. She didn't have the strength to. She returned to the house with him, numb and silent. The door closed behind them, and the lock clicked. The familiar scent of the house hit her immediately. The air felt heavier. The silence inside was immediate, unnerving. Jeremy didn't yell. He didn't ask where she had gone. He simply told her to take a shower and get ready for dinner. His tone was cold, businesslike, as though everything could return to the routine he had constructed. But something had shifted in Amy. The fragile compliance she had clung to for survival was cracking. Her chest felt tight. Her mind raced. Later that evening, in the kitchen, the tension returned. Jeremy moved around the room slowly, deliberately. He asked questions she didn't answer. He set 2 plates on the table and poured drinks. Amy sat stiffly in the chair, arms crossed over her chest, her mind swimming in confusion and panic. When he touched her shoulder, something inside her broke. Her breathing grew erratic. He tried to calm her, but she stood up quickly and backed away. The air was electric with fear. Jeremy stepped toward her, arms out in a feigned attempt to comfort, and that's when she saw it, the kitchen knife on the counter, just behind him. Her eyes locked on it. He noticed too late. Her hand moved before her thoughts could catch up. The metal felt cold, hard, unfamiliar in her hand. She raised it with trembling fingers, eyes wide, vision blurred by tears and adrenaline. He stepped closer. She screamed. The knife struck once, quick and deep. Jeremy fell backward, gasping, clutching his side. The silence that followed was suffocating. Amy dropped the knife. Her body shook violently. Blood spread across the floor in dark pools, thick and slow. She stood frozen, unable to breathe, unable to speak. The house was no longer silent, it was screaming through every wall, every shadow. She backed away, her back hitting the refrigerator, eyes fixed on the motionless form in front of her. Outside, the street remained quiet. No one knew what had just happened behind the brick walls of that small home. But inside, the years of grief, silence, and control had finally exploded. Amy crumpled to the floor, knees pulled to her chest, rocking in place. Her world had finally broken open, but at a cost she could barely comprehend. The only thing louder than the sound of her breath was the sound of the sirens approaching in the distance. The trial began in late October 2016, nearly 7 months after the night Amy Watson was found sitting in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor of her childhood home. The prosecutors called it a domestic homicide. The headlines described it as a tragedy. But inside the courtroom, the truth was more complicated. The girl who sat silently at the defense table bore little resemblance to the high school senior in her yearbook photo. Amy's face was pale, her shoulders rounded forward, her gaze fixed on the floor. She spoke little. Her lawyer spoke for her. The court proceedings took place in the Dauphin County Courthouse, a towering building of sandstone and iron that cast long shadows across the streets of Harrisburg. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation. On one side sat the prosecution, presenting a narrative of a disturbed teenager who had lashed out in grief. On the other sat Amy's defense, assembling a picture of prolonged emotional manipulation, coercive control, and psychological trauma. The prosecution's case relied heavily on forensic evidence: the knife, the trajectory of the wound, the blood spatter patterns on the tile. They showed diagrams, photos, medical records. They emphasized that Jeremy had been unarmed, that he had made no threats, that the fatal wound was deep and deliberate. But the defense had something stronger: Amy's silence. Her silence during the weeks that followed her mother's death. Her silence during the nights she lay awake in her mother's bed. Her silence in the basement. Her silence in the police car, hands cuffed, clothes soaked in blood. That silence spoke louder than any scream. Her attorney described the house as a slow-moving trap, a prison constructed out of grief and control. They introduced evidence of confinement: the locked basement door, the moved belongings, the neighbor's testimony about Amy's absence from school and public life. They presented written notes from Amy's journals, found hidden beneath her mattress, short, panic messages written in shaky handwriting, referencing fear, isolation, and a desperate need to escape. Psychological evaluations were conducted by court-appointed professionals. Amy was described as emotionally blunted, exhibiting symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder and prolonged emotional abuse. The psychologist testified that Amy had endured a breakdown of personal agency, that her sense of reality had been slowly eroded by the trauma she experienced in the home. Layla and her parents also took the stand. They described the day Amy arrived barefoot, trembling, barely coherent. They spoke about the calm but unsettling demeanor of Jeremy when he came to retrieve her. Their testimony added context to the otherwise silent timeline of Amy's isolation. In a pivotal moment of the trial, the defense presented digital records showing that Amy had not contacted a single person in the weeks leading up to the stabbing: not friends, not teachers, not emergency services. The defense argued that this was not an oversight, but a sign of complete control. The prosecution countered by reiterating that no formal reports of abuse had been filed, no bruises documented, no prior interventions requested. But the jury remained focused on the totality of what had occurred, not simply the act of violence, but the context surrounding it. Amy never took the stand. She remained still throughout the trial, occasionally glancing at the screen when images from the house were displayed. The jury saw photographs of her childhood bedroom, now empty. The master bedroom, rearranged to accommodate her belongings. The basement door, reinforced with a new lock. They saw the knife, the bloodstains, the photo of Jeremy Watson, smiling, unaware that his life would be unraveled not by rage, but by the consequences of years of quiet control. After 2 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict. Amy was found not guilty of murder. Instead, the court acknowledged her actions as self-defense under extreme psychological duress. The judge delivered the ruling calmly, acknowledging the uniqueness of the case. Amy Watson would not serve time in prison. Instead, she would be placed under supervised psychiatric care and mandatory trauma counseling. She would remain in the care of a court-approved guardian until deemed emotionally and mentally stable enough to live independently. Following the verdict, the media quickly lost interest. There were no national headlines, no interviews, no sensational follow-ups. The story faded from public view, swallowed by larger narratives. But in Harrisburg, the house on Belmont and Reeves remained empty. A for sale sign appeared months later, the windows boarded up, the garden overgrown. The new owners gutted the interior completely, removing all traces of the life that had once existed within its walls. Amy relocated to a different part of the state, where she began the slow process of reclaiming her identity. Her guardian, a licensed trauma therapist, reported steady progress. She enrolled in night classes under a different last name. She did not speak publicly about the events of that year. Her past remained a silent shadow, present but unspoken. Years later, court transcripts would be reviewed by legal scholars studying the intersections of trauma and criminal justice. Her case was cited in academic texts about coercive control and teenage psychological resilience. But for Amy, no validation from strangers could undo what had been done. The trial had given her a legal freedom. Healing would take much longer. She often walked alone in the early mornings, when the streets were empty and the air cool. The world still felt uncertain. But she no longer watched every shadow. She no longer waited for footsteps outside her door. The silence was hers now. And it no longer frightened her.